What is up? I'm Mr. Bravada. I'm recording this video for my AP Government students that I will be teaching in the spring, since I posted a big pre-election bonus project as well as an Electoral College prediction bonus opportunity. I thought it would be a good idea to just record some videos about the upcoming election forecast and what the polls are saying. This turns out to be a good video and it's not complete and utter crap, I will post it to YouTube. So I figured the best way to do this is to divide it up into two different videos. Part one will be why you should trust polls, and then part two will be what the 2020 polls are saying. So I'm doing part one because, as you see here, after the 2016 elections, many people do not trust the polls. If you recall, in 2016, most polls said that Clinton was going to win and win easily. And going into that election night, it was a very big surprise for most people, but probably not Trump supporters, that Clinton lost. And not only did she lose, she lost by a pretty wide electoral margin. So if that's the case, unless I can convince you that polls matter and are reliable, then you're not really going to listen to anything I have to say in the second part of the video. So in this video, we're going to talk about 2016, what went wrong, and then what has changed in 2020 because of the problems in 2016. So first, let's just establish the fact that most Americans don't trust polls. Now, yes, I know it's ironic that I'm going to show you polls proving that Americans don't trust polls, but like, yeah. So, in a Hill-Harris X polls, they said 52% of registered voters say they doubt what they hear about in the news media, particularly for polling. All right, so let's take a look at the NPR PBS NewsHour poll. They partner with Marist College for this. A lot of media outlets partner with colleges or other institutions to do their polling, right? So Marist does high quality, reputable polling, has for years. They partner up with NPR, PBS, New York Times, ABC News partners with Siena College, and then there's a few others that are well-known pollsters like Monmouth University is a reputable polling outlet. So if you look at this data, this was taken in 2017, but looking at Gallup and Pew polls for 2020, it's not that much different. Amongst national adults, you'll see here the number of people who do not trust polls, either not very much or not at all, is at 37%, right? However, if you change that to Republicans, that becomes 38% are not trusting of polls. And then if you break it even further down to Trump supporters, that becomes 44%. So trust for polls, especially the amount of people who trust polls a great deal, is rather low. So let's talk about why you should trust polls, at least in 2020, more than in 2016. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to look at things that were unanticipated in 2016, right? Things that polls got wrong, that were sort of outside of their control. All right, so before we do that though, let's take a look at what I'm talking about and why most Americans distrust polls after the 2016 election. So this is the final 538 forecast going into November 3rd. So Clinton with a 71.4%, okay? What's key to know about this, first off, is 71% is not 100%. Many people were acting like everybody just completely wrote off Trump and did not give him a path to victory. okay? Sometimes polls are more based on what we don't know than what we do know, all right? Now, when you look at some of this polling from a national level, the national level polling as far as the popular vote was not very off, okay? Now, most of the polls of the polling aggregate for 538 had Hillary Clinton with about a, what was that, 3.6% lead in the popular vote. Ultimately, she won by 2.1% of the vote. Now, the average margin of error for a scientific poll is 3 to 4%. Normally, if you get above 1,000 people, it's scientifically valid and has a margin of about 4%. 2,000 people, margin of error is 3%. And then after that, you have diminishing returns, and it doesn't really matter. All right. So the national polling was not that off. What was off was the state level polling, okay? But why was it off? Well, first of all, in 2016, you had 15% of voters that were undecided by November 3rd. Now, perhaps some of those people were just unwilling to admit that they knew who they were going to vote for, and this is what are called shy Trump voters. And you have a lot of people who said that you had people who were just unwilling to admit that they were Trump voters, right? The silent majority, right? And so that silent majority broke in vast numbers to Trump. Now, there's conflicting data on whether or not that is true, but what we do know is that 15% of undecided voters was 3 times higher than it was in 2012. So when you look at the data, you had way more undecided voters on the day of election. Now, what that ultimately amounted to was 1 in every 7 people in swing states made up their mind within the last few days of the election, which meant it was difficult to get reliable polling data in those last few days. Now, further breaking that down, what ultimately happened is a large number of those people broke for Trump, okay? That number was 30% more in favor of Trump in Wisconsin. So Trump got a 30% bump among those 15% undecided voters in Wisconsin. That number was 17% for Florida and about 17% again for Pennsylvania. All right. And roughly about the same for Michigan as well. And so when you look at like what really went wrong as far as the polling data, they got the Midwest wrong. Okay, but we'll dive further into that in a little bit, right? But that wasn't necessarily their fault, because how can you accurately predict how people are going to break late? Now, there were some hints. One of the big things that happened, again, outside of pollsters' control, was the October surprise, the late October surprise, the bombshell October 28th Comey press conference. Now, conservatives, Trump, Republicans hate Comey, but what you have to realize is on October 28th, in a rather unprecedented move, Comey had a press conference saying that they still had found new emails that were, I think, quote unquote, pertinent to the investigation about Hillary Clinton. Now, we don't really have reliable data on how much that mattered, but you're talking about 5 days before an election, the director of the FBI has a press conference or releases a letter to Congress, actually, saying that they were basically continuing or reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton. Now, Hillary Clinton already had very high disfavorability ratings. She was an unlikable candidate. And that's not my opinion, though it is my opinion. I didn't find her very likable. Most people found her very unlikable. She was actually the second most unlikable candidate in modern history. The most unlikable candidate being Donald Trump. So you had two people in 2016 that had very high disfavorability ratings or very high unlikability ratings. So between that October 28th letter to Congress that Comey wrote and the fact that you had 3 times more undecided voters than in previous years, and the fact that most of those voters broke for Trump day of, made it rather difficult to ascertain exactly where it was going. Now, you can blame Nate Silver and 538 or Real Clear Politics and 270 to Win or these other aggregate firms that make predictions on not accounting for that fact. But basically what had to happen is nearly all of those late voters would have to break for Trump and break for Trump in the swing states. But they did, okay? So let's now dive into the issues that there were in the 2016 polling, okay? And then we'll transition to how they fixed those issues for 2020 and why the 2020 numbers are probably more reliable. So the biggest issue is going to be the education weighting. All right. Now, for education weighting, what ultimately happened was that, and let me show you, pull up some graphs here. What pollsters failed to account for is that people with a college degree are way more likely to respond to polls. So they undervalued non-college educated people, particularly non-college educated whites, when they release their polls. Because when you poll, you're not simply releasing the data as is, you weight it, right? So let's say you get a representative sample of 2,000 people, right? So randomly, you call 2,000 people, you get the data. You then have to weight it for age, for race, for party identification, etc., right? Like, if you get equal numbers of 18 to 29-year-olds and over 65-year-olds, each individual is not going to count for the same. Why? Because 65 and older are way more likely to show up at the polls than younger people. So you have to weight it differently. What they didn't do was adjust for that educational attainment and the fact that they had way more college educated whites that responded to the polling. And what they didn't know was just how big of a factor that would be. So let's take a look at the screen right here. In 2012, if you didn't wait for education in 2012, you would get basically a 0.5% advantage to Democrats, okay? But ultimately, that resulted in a plus 4% margin for Democrats in 2016. The reason is, and let's go to here, is Trump won non-college educated whites by a much, much bigger margin than historical trends, okay? And Clinton got white college educated votes on a way higher level than previous. So like when you look here, this is a 17-point difference among all voters. That's what happened. When you account for college degree, okay? People with a college degree were 17 points more likely to vote for Clinton, okay? That number was even bigger for when you just have like white college educated people. So the fact that you didn't have the education weighting and the fact that that trend, because I mean, look at it in 2012, it's not that big of a difference, right? And so like when you start looking into the specific counties in swing states, you can clearly see the difference and the trend that's happening. Ohio, look at Ohio. So the darker blue line is high education counties. The lighter blue lines is low education counties, okay? The low education counties, so in other words, areas in which a less percentage of people have college degrees, okay? drastically split. Okay, educated people in educated counties went for Clinton. Okay, counties where you had blue collar whites drastically went for Trump in most swing state and all swing states, right? I mean, you can see it right here. Now, so when you look at this like on a national level and then you break it down by the 50 most educated counties, you see that Clinton almost won all of the counties that were very educated. And I think I want to say there's only one county on this entire list for the top 50 educated counties. Nope, there's two. Okay, Story, Iowa, here went down 1.6%, and then it looks like in Madison, Mississippi, went down 0.3%. But in almost every single high education county, you had a big shift from Obama to Clinton. Whereas it's the opposite for Trump. So you look at the least educated counties in America, and they almost all went to Trump. So first of all, at a base level, they're almost all Republican, right? But you start taking some swing states like Arizona, North Carolina, Ohio. So here's Ohio right here. And what happens, and here's another Ohio, here's another Ohio. You went from 11 point, like Obama is 11 points down in these Ohio counties to negative 41 down. A 30% shift in rural counties in a swing state. That is huge. And so when the polls didn't account for that weighting, and when they're calling people and you couple it with the fact that most people who answer and respond to polls are likely to be college educated, that is a massive, massive problem that's on the horizon. One that they did not anticipate, okay? And we'll talk about how that's, going to be anticipated for 2020. I mean, pretty obvious to figure out. They're, weighting education now in 2020. And so this ultimately, provides an error that was unanticipated for the pollsters. And here's just another to just, show you even more data on the breakdown. College grad versus non-college grad. So college grad 57% for Clinton versus 36% Trump. Again, just to reiterate that divide. Now, what the other big factor and why the 2016 polls got it wrong was there wasn't a lot of high quality state polling. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So national polls weighted for education 50%. And again, we talked about the fact that the national polls weren't that off. Many had Clinton 4 to 6% up, and she ultimately won by 2. But again, margin of error 3 to 4%. It's not that big of a deal. Once you start looking into battleground states and battleground non-online polls, you'll start to see that very few of them weighted for education. This is why the state level polls were more off than the national polls, okay? And so that is a big issue. So let's sort of dive into the Midwest and the polls and what exactly they got wrong. So let's go back to the map and the final forecast on 538. All right, so as you see here, they had Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, all going for Clinton. Those states would all need a break for Trump. I mean, maybe not all of them, but I mean, if he gets Florida and Pennsylvania, I mean, that's 14 and 29 electoral votes. sorry, 20 and 29. And so when you look at the polling for that, all right, final polls, you had about a 10-point lead for Clinton as far as chances of victory. But you look at what their final polling was as far as on election day or before election day, and you're talking about very, very slim margins. Look at this. Even on November 2nd, you had Trump with a 0.1% lead. So yeah, Clinton with a 0.6% lead, again, within the margin of error. Chances of winning 55%. That is a huge split, right? Like, most of the time when people win Florida, you win the Electoral College. It's pretty darn rare that you lose Florida and still win the national election. It is one of the biggest predictors and the most important swing states, right? So let's look at Pennsylvania, okay? Election day, about what, 4% as far as the polling. Again, somewhat within the margin of error, but if you account for the fact that you had 15% day of undecided voters, it's going to split. Michigan, okay, margin of error, right? Wisconsin, a little bit outside of the margin of error, but still pretty close, all right? So then, how did it actually turn out? Well, so here is the ultimate map. So let's take a look. I guess we'll go ahead and look at the national vote first, right? So 48% to 45.9%, 2.1%. Again, national polls, for the most part, had it right, at least more right than the state level polling, okay? And listen, there's way too much focus on national level polling. And I wanted to mention this earlier. Where is it at? Okay. So let's do this one first. The fact of the matter is, because the way the Electoral College is set up, Democrats have to win nationally. Like, if you want to convert national polls to a chance of winning the Electoral College, right? You have to be up like 3 to 5 points, okay? Which a lot of people thought that Clinton was up 3 to 5 points. The fact that she was only up 2%, right, meant that she had like a 54% chance winning. So when you look back at this election forecast and you see Clinton at 71.5%, right, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense if polling she's at 3.5 to 4% nationally, right? But the fact that she was at 2.1 meant, like, actually she had somewhere between a 29 and 54% chance of winning. And that has to do with the Electoral College, right? Because these rural states that have low populations benefit from the fact that they have 2 senators, right? Because each state's electoral votes is your number of representatives in Congress based on population plus your number of senators. So when North Dakota and Wyoming and South Dakota and Montana gets those extra 2 senators each and they vote Republican, okay, they are, each individual voter in those states is actually mathematically more valuable than a voter in New York or California. This is why it's, the Electoral College is sort of stacked against Democratic candidates, right? So that's number one. And I guess while we're at it, I'm just going to go ahead and show this, because a lot of people, you know, when they talk about polls, particularly conservatives, you know, say, oh, it's fake news, liberals are skewing it, which, again, doesn't make sense, because if you're a liberal polling firm or you're a partisan polling firm, why would you want to say that Hillary Clinton had a huge lead on Trump? Because then basically people look at the poll and then they're not motivated to go out, because then it's not going to matter. So the incentive's not really there. Historically, it goes back and forth between whether or not, you know, aggregate polling averages are more like wrong in the favor of Democrats or Republicans. As you can see here, most of the polling data for the midterms, you know, had Republicans, you know, a little bit higher. Yes, Democrats, you know, more often from 2000 to 2018, it looks like they benefit from that polling error a little more, but that's within the margin of error, and you're looking at 0.6%, 0.8%. How much does that really matter? Not much. All right, so let's go back to our analysis here. So remember, Wisconsin, okay, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, all, they had at least 538, all had Trump. And so 538, by the way, if you don't know, basically is a polling aggregator. They take a bunch of different polls, they put it into an algorithm, and then, you know, that's what they do. So election forecast, again, okay, looking at it, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, and I mean, we can include North Carolina as well. They actually had Ohio going to Trump. All right, so Wisconsin, 0.7%, I'm so bad at math, 0.7% difference. Not much at all. Michigan, 0.3%. Super small percentage to Trump. Pennsylvania, again, 0.7%, right? Nope, wait, hold on. 48, yeah. I can do arithmetic, I think. Yeah, okay. Florida, a little bit more of a margin, right? So that's 1.2%. So it's not as if, you know, these polls that had Clinton up 3 to 4% were like hugely off. Were they off? Yeah, okay, because they were barely outside the margin of error, right? But when you look at these important states, right, they all went Trump. They all broke Trump. And so, like, you look, Michigan tends to vote more Democrat. Trump stole Michigan, if you want to phrase it that way. Okay, Clinton didn't steal any, you know, leaning red states. And then you look at the toss-up states, and Trump won the important one. Like, sure, okay, so Clinton got New Hampshire. Okay, but like, how much does New Hampshire matter? 4 electoral votes? Doesn't really matter, right? When you look at Florida, and Florida's got 29, and Pennsylvania's got 20, and Ohio's 18, and Michigan's 16, and Wisconsin's 10. You know, the fact that she's getting Nevada and New Hampshire, and you know, Nevada only has 6, doesn't really matter. So not only does he get, you know, Michigan with their electoral votes here at 16, he gets these toss-ups that are pretty much all of the more important toss-up states, okay? So, all in all, those are the big main reasons why the polls were wrong, but also demystifying it a little bit and playing down on the myth that they were like bigly wrong. Oh my god, I just said bigly. Okay. Next, I'm going to say huge. Jesus. Okay. So, what else mattered? The other thing that mattered, and this goes back to that the 15% undecided voters, is the number of voters voting for the first time in 2016. More of them were leaning Trump and voted Trump than what the polls accounted for. Okay, and the way they did likely voters, because one thing that matters in election forecast isn't necessarily as much about what the polling says as determining who the likely voters are. That's why you need to pay attention to polling, because it's either polling amongst like the national audience or likely voters. And most of the polls that you're going to see, they're going to say likely voters. How do you determine a likely voter? The way they did it in 2016 is they asked people a number of questions, right? How enthusiastic are you, right? And Trump had that enthusiasm gap because his supporters were more enthusiastic. But how enthusiastic are you? How likely are you to vote? Very likely, somewhat likely, unsure, not too likely, very, very unlikely. They would ask you, did you vote in the 2014 midterms? Did you vote in 2012? What party are you registered as? Do you know where your polling location is? And all of these indices would be put together, and if you crossed a certain threshold, you would be a likely voter. Trump ended up getting a lot of first-time voters, blue-collar workers, or maybe not even first-time voters, but people who are somewhat apathetic about voting, didn't vote in the 2014 midterms, may not have voted in 2012, or perhaps voted for Obama in 2012, and then they shifted, right? And so what happened is the polls would either put you at 0% or 100% for your likelihood to vote, based on whether you cross that threshold according to the various questions they ask. Well, what that means is if you have 30% of your people that you put at 0% chance of vote, and then those people vote, and then they break Trump, your models are going to be wrong. So one thing, and this is going to get into the next video that I'm going to make, or maybe I'll just do it here. I don't know who the hell is still listening to this. I don't know how long this has been. It's been like 5 minutes, 30 minutes? I don't know. So one thing that they're doing this year in 2020 is having probabilistic models that have a linear progression, right? And so nobody is going to be above 90% likely to vote, and nobody is going to be below 10%. They're going to put you at a percentage likely to vote to account for that. So they're still going to ask you all those questions, and they're going to pull up voting data because it's public record to see if you voted in local elections, state elections, midterms, etc. But it's not going to be an all or nothing proposition, right? And then obviously they are starting to weight education way more. And then the other big difference is we are getting high quality state level polling, okay? One of the reasons, all right, so state level polling is way costlier and more difficult, particularly now in the past decade or two, because you have a lot of local newspapers that have shut down. And so a lot of polling firms relied on local newspapers to help them do it, right? But because of the lessons learned in 2016, we have like 5 high quality polls coming out of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Iowa, right? And by high quality polls, I'm talking about those Siena College polls, the Monmouth University polls, the Quinnipiac polls, and then you have less reliable polls, you know, like Trafalgar, Rasmussen. They got it right in 2016, but they've consistently had Trump at like approval ratings that are like 10 and 12 points higher than everybody else. So it's somewhat of an outlier. But we're getting high quality polls at the state level, all right? And so that's one thing that they fixed, along with the waiting for education, and the probabilistic models. So things are better. And you can actually see that things are better based off of the 2018 election forecast, right, for the midterms. So let's just take a look at the 2018 House forecast. Here's the final one for 538. And 538 partners with ABC News. And so like the most likely chance that they had, let's see, 2.7, 2.8, was a plus 40 seat swing where you would have Democrats at 235, Republicans at 200. That was the most likely scenario, or 234 and 201, right? Somewhere around there. So what ultimately happened? Well, 235 to 200, right? That's what happened. The polls in 2018 were spot on. All right. So if there's any indication that national level and state level pollsters learned their lesson in 2016 and started to adjust their models, you can see it here. The other thing that you can look up is these toss-ups, and I'm going to get into this way more in the second video that I make about actually predicting this election. And hopefully by now I've somewhat convinced you, or at least made you a little more willing to trust the polls in 2020, is that most of these toss-ups went for Democrats. And the reason that they went for Democrats is because they ran moderates in those seats. And the education gap is continuing to grow, as well as the gender gap. Now, oh man, I'm excited. Okay, I'm gonna end this video. I think I pretty much got through everything about what went wrong in 2016, why 2020 is more reliable. So I'm going to cut it here, and then later today or tomorrow, I'm going to post a video for just not necessarily my predictions, but just what the polls are showing right now as we head into election day on Tuesday. So signing off for now.